The winter of 1942 descended upon the Volga River like an executioner's blade. Stalingrad, once a thriving industrial city of 400,000 souls, had been reduced to a skeletal landscape of shattered concrete and twisted steel. The temperature plummeted to minus 35 degrees Celsius. In this apocalyptic theater, approximately 1.1 million men would collide in what historians would later recognize as the turning point of World War II SS Unterscharführer Klaus Becker, 23 years old, from the small Bavarian town of Rosenheim, arrived at Stalingrad on September 14, 1942, as part of the 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus. His unit, attached to the 24th Panzer Division, had been tasked with securing the Northern Industrial District. Becker kept a detailed diary, fragments of which survived the war and now reside in the German military archives in Freiburg. His account provides one of the most harrowing testimonies of the encirclement and the Soviet counteroffensive that would trap nearly 500,000 Axis soldiers. The German advance into Stalingrad had begun with confidence bordering on arrogance. Hitler had declared the city must fall, not merely for strategic reasons — it controlled the vital oil routes from the Caucasus — but for symbolic ones. The city bore Stalin's name. Its capture would humiliate the Soviet dictator, and Hitler believed break Soviet morale entirely. By November 1942, the German 6th Army controlled approximately 90% of Stalingrad. They held the Barricadi gun factory, the Red October steel plant, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory. German soldiers could see the Volga River from their positions. Victory seemed within grasp. But the city had become a meat grinder. Soviet General Vasily Zhukov, commanding the 62nd Army, had implemented a strategy of hugging the enemy, keeping Soviet positions so close to German lines that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb without hitting their own troops. Becker's diary entry from November 10, 1942 reads, "We control the factory, but we do not control the war. Every room is a fortress, every staircase a killing ground. We advance 3 meters and lose 5 men. The Russians fight like demons. They emerge from the rubble like ghosts. Yesterday, Corporal Miller was killed by a Soviet sniper while eating his rations. The bullet entered through his open mouth. We couldn't even scream. We've learned that sound draws death here." The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, had been planning something unprecedented. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's most capable military commander, had been quietly assembling massive forces north and south of Stalingrad. Operation Uranus, the codename for the Soviet counteroffensive, involved over 1 million troops, 13,500 artillery pieces, 894 tanks, and 1,115 aircraft. The plan was elegantly brutal. Strike the weakly held flanks of the German 6th Army, defended primarily by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops with inferior equipment, and encircle the entire German force. Zhukov understood the psychology of encirclement. He had studied Hannibal's victory at Cannae, where the Carthaginian general had surrounded and destroyed a Roman army twice his size. But Zhukov's vision was more ambitious. He would create a pocket so vast, so complete, that escape would be impossible. And then, methodically, he would crush everything inside it. November 19, 1942, dawned gray and bitterly cold. At 7:20 hours, the Soviet artillery barrage began. Becker wrote, "The earth itself seemed to scream. We had experienced artillery before, but nothing like this. The sound was not individual explosions, but a continuous roar like standing inside a waterfall made of fire. The Romanian positions to our north simply ceased to exist. We could see the flashes lighting up the horizon like a false dawn. We knew something terrible was coming, but we didn't yet understand we were already dead men." The Soviet 5th Tank Army and 21st Army smashed through the Romanian 3rd Army north of Stalingrad. Within hours, the Romanian lines had disintegrated. Survivors fled in panic, abandoning equipment, weapons, and wounded comrades. The Soviet tanks, primarily T-34s, superior to most German armor in these conditions, poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. Simultaneously, south of Stalingrad, the Soviet 51st and 57th Armies attacked the Romanian 4th Army. The pattern repeated: overwhelming artillery preparation, followed by massed armor and infantry assault. The Romanians, equipped with obsolete Czech-made tanks and insufficient anti-tank weapons, stood no chance. On November 23, 1942, at approximately 1600 hours, Soviet forces from the northern and southern pincers met near the town of Kalach on the Don, about 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The trap had closed. Inside the pocket, the entire German 6th Army, parts of the 4th Panzer Army, and remnants of Romanian divisions, approximately 290,000 men initially, though this number would swell to over 450,000 as German units retreated into the pocket seeking safety. Becker's diary entry from November 24th, "We received the order to hold our positions. No retreat. The radio announces that relief is coming, that the Luftwaffe will supply us by air. But we can see the Soviet tanks on the horizon now, where there should be our supply lines. The men are asking questions I cannot answer. How long can we hold? Where is the relief? I tell them what I've been told. The Führer has ordered us to stand fast. But at night, when I'm alone, I wonder if we've been forgotten, or worse, if we've been sacrificed." The encirclement created a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep. Inside this frozen hell, nearly 500,000 men faced a Soviet force that would eventually number over 1 million. Zhukov's strategy was not to immediately assault the pocket. That would be costly. Instead, he would squeeze it, compress it, and let winter, starvation, and despair do much of the killing. The Luftwaffe had promised to deliver 500 tons of supplies daily, the minimum needed to sustain the trapped army. They never came close. On the best days, they delivered 300 tons. On most days, far less. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns took a devastating toll. German transport planes, Ju-52s and He-111s, fell from the sky in flames, their precious cargoes of bread, ammunition, and medicine scattered across the frozen steppe. By early December, the rations inside the pocket had been cut to 200 grams of bread per day, roughly 2 slices. Horses were slaughtered for meat. When the horses were gone, men ate anything. Leather belts boiled into soup, sawdust mixed with flour, even wallpaper paste. Becker recorded, "Hunger is not dramatic. It's boring. It's the constant gnawing in your belly that never stops. It's watching your hands become skeletal, your uniform hang loose. It's the way your mind slows down, the way climbing stairs becomes an expedition." Yesterday, Private Hoffman died, not from a wound. He simply sat down in the snow and didn't get up. We were too weak to bury him properly. The cold was equally merciless. Temperatures regularly dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers equipped for a summer campaign that was supposed to end before winter lacked adequate cold weather gear. Frostbite became epidemic. Medical reports from the pocket document thousands of cases of severe frostbite requiring amputation. But there were no supplies for surgery, no anesthesia, often not even bandages. Men with blackened, frozen limbs simply waited to die. Soviet forces, meanwhile, tightened the noose. Zhukov employed a strategy of constant pressure, probing attacks, artillery bombardments, sniper operations designed to erode German strength without committing to costly frontal assaults. He could afford to wait. Time was his ally. On December 12, 1942, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, an attempt to break through to the encircled 6th Army. The 4th Panzer Army, reinforced with elite units, drove toward Stalingrad from the southwest. For a brief moment, hope flickered in the pocket. Manstein's forces advanced to within 48 kilometers of the encirclement. Becker wrote on December 19th, "We can hear the artillery from the relief force. It's so close. Some men are crying with joy. We've been ordered to prepare for a breakout. But then, the order is countermanded. We're to hold our positions. The Führer has forbidden retreat. The relief force will come to us. But every hour, the artillery sounds a little more distant. And we understand. They're not getting closer. They're being pushed back." Zhukov had anticipated the relief attempt. He positioned strong reserves to block Manstein's advance while simultaneously launching Operation Little Saturn, an offensive aimed at the Italian 8th Army further north. This forced the Germans to divert resources from the relief effort. By December 23rd, Manstein's offensive had stalled. The distance to the pocket had grown to over 70 kilometers. The relief attempt had failed. Inside the pocket, the situation deteriorated from desperate to apocalyptic. The Potomnik airfield, the main supply lifeline, came under constant Soviet artillery fire. Wounded men promised evacuation lay in the snow for days, waiting for planes that never came. When planes did land, scenes of horror unfolded. Soldiers, crazed with fear and hunger, rushed the aircraft, fighting each other for a seat. Officers shot their own men to maintain order. Becker's entry from January 8, 1943. The Russians offered us surrender terms today. General Paulus rejected them. We were told that surrender is dishonorable, that Germany is preparing a new offensive to rescue us. No one believes this anymore. We've stopped talking about the future. We talk only about the past, about home, about food we once ate, about women we loved. The present is too terrible to discuss. The future doesn't exist. On January 10, 1943, Zhukov launched Operation Ring, the final destruction of the Stalingrad pocket. 7 Soviet armies, totaling over 280,000 troops, began the systematic annihilation of the German 6th Army. The artillery preparation lasted several hours. Over 7,000 guns fired simultaneously, creating a barrage of unprecedented intensity. The pocket began to collapse. Soviet forces advanced from all directions, compressing the Germans into an ever smaller area. The Potomnik airfield fell on January 16th, cutting off the last reliable supply route. The remaining German forces were pushed back into the ruins of Stalingrad itself. The very city they had fought so hard to capture now became their tomb. Becker's diary entries became increasingly fragmented. January 18th. Lost contact with battalion. 15 men left in my unit. No ammunition for the machine gun. January 22nd. Found a dead horse. Ate it raw. Too weak to make fire. January 26th. Can't remember last time I felt warm. Feet black. Can't walk properly. January 30th. Heard Paulus promoted to field marshal. Hitler's message. No German field marshal has ever surrendered. We understand. We're expected to die. The final phase of the battle was not warfare, but slaughter. German soldiers, starved, frozen, and out of ammunition, could offer little resistance. Soviet troops advanced through the ruins, clearing bunkers and cellars. The fighting was close quarters and brutal. No quarter was given or expected. On January 31, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus, newly promoted and facing the impossible choice between mass suicide and surrender, chose surrender. He and his staff were captured in the basement of the Univermag department store. The southern pocket of German resistance collapsed. The northern pocket, where Becker was located, held out for 2 more days. On February 2, 1943, the last German units surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The statistics are almost incomprehensible. Of the approximately 290,000 German and Axis soldiers initially trapped in the pocket, only about 91,000 survived to surrender. The rest, nearly 200,000 men, died from combat, starvation, disease, or cold during the encirclement. Of those 91,000 who surrendered, only about 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest died in Soviet captivity, succumbing to typhus, dysentery, and the lingering effects of starvation. Soviet casualties were equally staggering. The Red Army lost approximately 1.1 million men killed, wounded, or missing during the entire Stalingrad campaign. The city itself was utterly destroyed. Not a single building remained intact. Becker survived. On February 2nd, he was captured by troops of the Soviet 21st Army. His diary, hidden in his boot, somehow survived the initial search. He spent 11 years in Soviet labor camps, primarily in the Ural Mountains, working in coal mines. He was repatriated to West Germany in 1954 as part of a prisoner exchange. In a 1978 interview with German historian Joachim Wieder, Becker reflected on the title's claim about 450,000 buried alive in 72 hours. He clarified, "It's not literally true that Zhukov buried us alive, but metaphorically, yes. From November 23rd, when the encirclement closed, we were dead men. The pocket was our grave. We just didn't know it yet. Zhukov didn't need to kill us quickly. He let winter, hunger, and hopelessness do the work." By the time Operation Ring began on January 10th, most of us were already corpses walking. The final assault was just making it official. The claim of 72 hours likely refers to the period from January 10th to 13th, 1943, when Operation Ring began, and the pocket was compressed by approximately half. During this period, Soviet forces advanced rapidly, overrunning German positions and inflicting catastrophic casualties. German medical reports from this period document the complete collapse of organized resistance in many sectors. However, historical accuracy demands clarification. The destruction of the Sixth Army was not accomplished in 72 hours, but over approximately 10 weeks, from November 23, 1942, to February 2, 1943. The encirclement itself was the killing stroke. The subsequent battles were the death throes. Zhukov's strategy at Stalingrad demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of modern warfare. He recognized that encirclement, when executed on a massive scale, creates conditions where the enemy destroys itself. Trapped forces consume their supplies, their morale collapses, disease spreads, and the will to fight evaporates. The attacker need only maintain the encirclement and apply steady pressure. The psychological impact of encirclement cannot be overstated. Soldiers can endure tremendous hardship if they believe relief is possible, if they can see a path to survival. Remove that hope, and even elite troops disintegrate. The German Sixth Army, which had conquered France and driven deep into the Soviet Union, was reduced to a starving, frozen mob in a matter of weeks. The Battle of Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. After Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht would never again launch a successful strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. The Red Army, having absorbed terrible losses, had learned how to fight and win against the previously unstoppable Wehrmacht. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a symbol of national resistance and sacrifice. The city was awarded the title Hero City, the highest honor in the Soviet Union. A massive memorial complex dominated by the towering statue "The Motherland Calls" was erected on Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that had been the scene of some of the fiercest fighting. Becker returned to Rosenheim in 1954. He never married, never spoke publicly about his experiences except for the single interview in 1978. He worked as a postal clerk until his retirement. His diary was donated to the German military archives after his death in 1989. In his final diary entry written on February 1, 1943, the day before his capture, Becker wrote, "I don't know if anyone will ever read these words. I don't know if I'll survive tomorrow, but if someone does find this, I want them to know. We were not heroes. We were not villains. We were men who followed orders into hell. We suffered. We died. And for what? For a dictator's pride. For a city that's now just rubble. I hope whoever reads this learns something from our suffering. I hope they learn that war is not glorious. It's not noble. It's cold and hungry and terrifying. And it should be avoided at all costs. Because here, in this frozen hell, I've learned the only truth that matters. There are no winners in war, only survivors and corpses. And sometimes, it's hard to tell the difference. The wind still blows across the Volga River. The city of Stalingrad, renamed Volgograd in 1961, has been rebuilt. Modern buildings stand where factories once burned, but beneath the streets, construction workers still occasionally unearth remains: a helmet, a rifle, bones. The dead of Stalingrad number in the hundreds of thousands, and many were never properly buried. Zhukov went on to become one of the most decorated military commanders in history. He led Soviet forces in the liberation of Eastern Europe and commanded the final assault on Berlin. He died in 1974. Honored as a hero of the Soviet Union. The lessons of Stalingrad echo through military history. The danger of overextension, the vulnerability of supply lines, the importance of logistics over tactics, the devastating effectiveness of encirclement, and above all, the terrible human cost of ideological warfare. Klaus Becker's testimony reminds us that behind every statistic, every casualty figure, every strategic analysis, there were individual human beings, men who felt cold, who felt hunger, who felt fear. They wrote letters home that were never delivered. They carried photographs of loved ones they would never see again. They died far from home, in a city most had never heard of before the war, for reasons many no longer understood. The titles claim that Zhukov buried 450,000 alive in 72 hours is hyperbolic, but captures an essential truth. The encirclement at Stalingrad was a death sentence executed in slow motion. From the moment the trap closed on November 23rd, the men inside were doomed. Whether they died in combat, from starvation, from cold, or in Soviet captivity, their fate was sealed by Zhukov's strategic brilliance and Hitler's strategic madness. The Battle of Stalingrad stands as one of the pivotal moments of the 20th century. It was the point where the tide turned, where the seemingly unstoppable German war machine ground to a halt and began its long, bloody retreat back to Berlin. It was where the Soviet Union, having suffered catastrophic losses in 1941 and 1942, proved it could not only survive but prevail. But for the men who fought there, for soldiers like Klaus Becker, Stalingrad was not a turning point or a strategic victory. It was simply hell. A frozen, starving, terrifying hell where men died by the thousands for every meter of rubble-strewn ground, where the temperature could kill as surely as a bullet, where hope died before the body did. In the end, Stalingrad teaches us that war, stripped of propaganda and ideology, is fundamentally about human suffering. It's about young men dying far from home. It's about the terrible choices commanders make, knowing those choices will cost thousands of lives. It's about the thin line between civilization and barbarism and how easily that line can be crossed when survival is at stake. The ruins of Stalingrad have been rebuilt. The dead have been buried or forgotten, but the lessons remain, carved into history like the names on a memorial wall. We remember Stalingrad not to glorify war, but to remind ourselves of its true cost. We remember the 450,000 who died there, German, Soviet, Romanian, Italian, Hungarian, not as statistics, but as human beings who suffered and died in one of the most terrible battles in human history. And we remember Klaus Becker's final words, "War should be avoided at all costs." Because in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, in the faces of starving soldiers, in the mass graves that dot the landscape, we see the truth that every generation must relearn. There is no glory in war, only suffering, death, and the faint hope that somehow, someday, we might learn to resolve our differences without turning our cities into graveyards and our young men into corpses. The Volga River still flows, the wind still blows across the steppe, and somewhere beneath the modern city, the dead of Stalingrad rest, their sacrifice a permanent reminder of the price of war and the value of peace.